Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Scott Stedman podcast. I hope you are having a great morning today. And today we have a special guest with us. We have Jordan West with us, who we are going to be interviewing and talking about his life and ministry. So we're so excited to have him on our show. So Jordan, welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thank you. I'm glad to be here with you guys today, man. Thanks for the invitation.
Yep. And also joining me is my co-host, Micah Current. Micah, how is it going now? How's life been since you've been adjusting to fatherhood?
Every day is a new day. I keep reminding myself of that. Like it's something different every day, but I'm good. Things are um it's a wild ride. I mean, you learn something new every day, and one day she's screaming because she's hungry and you're not feeding her enough because she's growing, and then the next day she's not eating because she doesn't want to eat. And then the next day she doesn't want to burp, and the next day she dirties like 30 diapers. I mean, it's just like every day is literally a roller coaster, but it's great. It's like one of the most humbling things you'll do in life. So
Absolutely. Absolutely. So stories gone wild. Before we dive into our interview with Jordan, we want to go ahead and share some of our wild ministry stories today. Micah, do you have one to share?
I do. So we went to church yesterday, and we started going to another church, and got connected with the pastor and knew the staff, some of the staff members, and they kind of know my story. And so we've been going there for about a month now. And so yesterday we walk into church and we're sitting literally in the back row because if the baby cries, I'm just going to get up and take her out of the sanctuary. And so this old lady comes up to me and she's like, "Are you Micah?" And I'm like, "Yeah." "Are you Micah Current?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And she's like, "Oh, you're Josh Bloom's friend." Josh Bloom's a guy I played music with years ago, like in this band. It was his grandmother. I'd never met his grandmother ever.
Mm.
And somehow she knew who I was in a random church on a random Sunday. And then Josh's mom was there too. And she's like, "Hey, it's Micah." I'm like, what am I supposed to say? Like, I mean, obviously I was nice and everything, but like, I was just like blown away that this old lady, like, we had never met ever, ever. I just thought it was really awkward and weird. I I mean, it was just super awkward because like the grandmother of one of my good friends who I've played music with for years uh knew who I was in a random church. So
Yeah, it's almost as weird as like when I worked at camp, and then I would go and be at college, and these kids would do these college visits, and they see me and they start yelling for me, and I'm looking at this kid and they're talking, and they're so excited to see me, and I'm sitting there thinking, I don't know who this kid is. I have no clue who
yeah.
you are. So I'm
That's
just
the
like, hey,
worst part about ministry, right? Like people will just come up and talk to you and you're in the back of your brain, right? You're trying to just subconsciously, who's this person? Who are they related to? What's their name? And
well, the
they've
funny
talked to you
thing,
before.
and the funny thing is, it's like I know they're from Marengo. I know they're from Ohio. I know they're from Marengo. I know I've seen this kid. I just have no clue what their name is in that moment. So I'm just like, hey man, it's good to see you. Like, how you doing? I just started a conversation, but I don't say their name, and they're just like, oh man, man, if you're here, I want to come to Anderson University. I'm like, well, maybe that's not a good choice to just come to the school because I'm here. But there you go. um, oh
What
boy.
about
So
what about you, Scott? Did you catch the church on fire yesterday, or did you
no,
have to call the?
it's been interesting dynamics at the church because we have a building supervisor that kind of handles all the building stuff. Building supervisor is out on medical leave, so it's kind of like everybody kind of doing whatever. And for the most part, we have people who come and clean the church, so it's not like big or anything major. But Sunday mornings, usually that's kind of like if something goes wrong, it's going to happen there, and sometimes
Of course.
it's just hard to figure out. Well, so I've been gone from church for like the last few weeks because I've been on a missions trip and then I was on vacation. So I was talking to our sound engineer, and he was just saying like, hey, I don't know what's going on if there's an issue with our internet company, but every Sunday I can never get internet in this room for our contemporary service. I can't stream. There's like nothing I can do because there's no internet in here. I'm like, well, that's weird, because I was just able to pull up all the check-in computers for our children's ministry, pull those up, and those are working fine. Everything's running fine. He goes, really? So I'm like, okay, let me brainstorm. So I'm walk out of the room. I go like maybe a couple feet down the hallway. Next thing you know, I have internet. I'm like, okay. I walk into that room, dead spot. I'm like, okay, this is weird. So we went around. We were unplugging routers, plugging them back in. I'm texting our building manager, see if they know anything. I'm texting everybody who it can figure out. Plus the pastor's not even there because they're on vacation. So it's like, I'm kind of trying to figure this out.
Isn't it always amazing how anytime something goes wrong, when you try to call somebody, nobody knows what's wrong, or nobody has any idea what's going on?
Well, the funny thing is I text someone, and I text our financial manager, because she's been there the longest. So if she knows anything, she pretty much knows the building inside and out. So she's like saying, well, try here. So she's kind of helping me like locate things, and I'm locating everything. We're resetting things, nothing. And we're just like, okay, we don't know what's going on. So we haven't streamed our contemporary service in like 3 weeks. And hopefully they'll figure out the problem this week so we can actually stream our services and do everything. But it's just been wild, like stuff like that, just because then it's like I'm trying to get my stuff that I need to do to get done for service, and I can't, because now I'm running around trying to fix another issue because it's kind of like a priority. And it's like, okay, well, oops, I forgot to get the snacks for the kids. Whoops. Okay, well, hold on, watch this video while I go grab your snacks now, kids. Like, it's stuff like that that kind of gets frustrating when you're trying to do everything and you're like, okay, like, well, there's nothing, it's all hands on deck now. But yep, so that was my story gone wild today. That happened yesterday. So Jordan, what about you? I know you're new, and again, you don't have to incriminate your church specifically where you're working at, but any stories gone wild from your years in ministry, anything that really pops out to you, you're like, yeah, this was odd or wild or weird?
I think the first thing that comes to mind, this is going back to 2015. Okay, so this is an older story, but it was a wild one. So I had just started at a brand new church for me in Oklahoma, and they moved me out there like 2 weeks before Easter, which is a really bizarre time to start at a church because that's like our big Sunday, right? And so my very first event on church staff was the Sunday before Easter. We did a big Easter egg thing, and churches still do it sometimes, but this kind of feels like it was a trend a little bit in later years. But it was the helicopter Easter egg drop. Are you guys familiar with the helicopter drop? Okay, so typically when you do a helicopter drop, we did it. There was over some baseball fields at a baseball complex there, and someone forgot to hold the kids like back off the field. And so the helicopter dropped 1,000 eggs on a field that was already full of kids. And it was like a battle scene, man. There's kids just getting absolutely blitzed by Easter eggs. And I mean, we're talking everything from like ages 2 to 10, and you just see kids dropping. I mean, these eggs the kids are getting hit. They're screaming. They're falling. There's kids laying on the field just getting pelted by eggs. And there was just sort of this, dude, there was this sort of just collective, like hands on the head, jaw open, like, oh, we messed up. And there's just kids getting laid out left and right. It was insane. I mean, it was a great idea that was poorly executed, and we learned the hard way the importance of dropping the eggs prior to the kids being on the field. And dude, it was wild. In the moment, I was like, oh, someone's getting fired for this. But now, 9 years later, I can look back at that story and laugh. But yeah, that's the first thing that I think of when I think of a wild church story.
I'm crying laughing. I don't think I've ever laughed so hard on a story's gone wild.
Yeah, those kids got crushed, man. There's got to be a kid that even now that has trauma from that can probably think back to getting hit in the forehead by a falling Easter egg. So
I could just see a parent going, "Okay, you ready to go to an Easter egg hunt?" No.
It's like a trigger word in the home now. They can't say Easter egg anymore. Yeah.
That kid has dreams of like a helicopter, and then there's like a Easter bunny dressed like Arnold Schwarzenegger with a Gatling gun that shoots Easter eggs out, and the kid's running for his life.
Just running for cover, man. It was crazy.
Oh wow, crazy. So, as we get to our main topic again, we have our special guest here, Jordan West, and the way Micah kind of presented it to me is just to kind of talk about your years of ministry. And you've how many years of ministry have you been serving, Jordan?
And I started serving in the church when I was 17 and started vocationally at 19. So golly, I guess I've been leading worship for 17 years now, and I've been doing this in some either part-time or full-time vocational capacity for the last 15 years, man.
Yeah. So kind of tell us a little bit about just kind of your call to ministry and just kind of, where the Lord has led you through these different churches and kind of where you're at now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was the kid in high school and really coming up through just all of my youth years, really kind of like your picture perfect kind of golden child. Like never really did anything wrong, was always a good student, always played sports, always went to youth group, always involved in church, like just kind of your good old all-American kid. And I really genuinely thought that I wanted to go to school. Something like business or law school was kind of on my radar, but really I was always focused on sports. And so in my head, college plans were going to revolve around athletics. I started leading worship at an FCA group at my school, my junior year of high school. And it was only because I could play 4 chords on the guitar. Like that was the only reason. Like it was in no way, shape or form was it a calling at that point, but began to sort of develop just a passion for music at that point. And I ended up going to school to play football in college. And man, I went to a small private school. And so I was sort of existed in this bubble. And I went to a secular, Division I college, and I went off the deep end. Like I tasted freedom and I did not know how to handle it. Made a lot of really bad life choices at that point. And because of that, I was asked to step away from the football team and to leave the school. Like I was living out in real time the consequences of bad decisions, which I'm sure we've all been there, right? So anyway, it was a season in my life, Scott, where I was going to parties, drinking alcohol, even doing some drugs, and just making bad life choices on a Friday and Saturday night. And I would come to church on Sunday morning and lead worship. And at that point, I just didn't understand. As a young man, I didn't understand the burden and the calling and the responsibility of ministry. And to me, at that point, it was really more of like something recreational that was a way to make a few extra bucks a week. And it wasn't something that I really understood as a calling at that point. When I was 22, I began to really sense that the Lord was getting a hold of my life. I sort of hit that proverbial rock bottom, if you will. My parents went through a divorce. My family life kind of imploded a little bit. And it was just sort of this moment of like, okay, something has to change. Something has to give. And there was a guy, he was a lifelong mentor for me at that point. His name was Dave Waller. He had always coached me in baseball, and his son was about my age. We grew up together. Just really a spiritual father that could speak into my life. And I'll never forget, he sat me down in March of that year and was like, listen, man, you're called to ministry, and you've been fighting this for a long time. We've seen this gifting on you for a long time. The Lord has been showing me it for a long time. And you have a decision to make if you're going to embrace that or if you're going to keep running from it. And that was a really pivotal moment in my life because someone had the boldness to speak truth into me, and I needed to hear it. And so that was a turning point. There's a school called Ocean's Edge School of Worship. It's based out of Calvary Chapel down in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And after lunch that day, after he gave me that hard talk, I called the school. He said, hey, there's the school. I had known about it from some buddies of mine that had been through the program there already. And I reached out to him. And that weekend, this was on a Tuesday, that weekend they had their final auditions for the upcoming school year. And this was in 2012. And so I was like, all right, well, you know what? let me show up. I'll give it a try. I walked into this audition totally unprepared, ill-equipped, undereducated musically, and really didn't know beans from beans at that point. By the grace of God and just the will that he had for my life, I was able to get into the school. And that sort of began a trajectory for me of like actually taking ministry serious. And so that was a big turning point, man. So I finished school. I worked with a church plant while I was in school there. I was the worship pastor there for some time. In 2014, my wife and I got married. And it's kind of funny, like coming out of worship school, my faculty there was like, hey, you're like the super contemporary guy. You're covered in tattoos. You play electric guitar. You're going to have an easy time finding a church. And so there was kind of this expectation like planted in my brain of like, I'm going to end up at like Elevation or Hillsong. Like in my head, like I romanticized this idea of being at the big contemporary church. And I graduated from school, and my first job was actually working in construction. I was like, this did not play out like I thought it would. Like, okay. So my bubble got burst pretty quick. And I ended up back at the church that I was at before school, which was a very small, the church itself was large, but I was at a small campus. It was a 2-campus Baptist church called Grace Fellowship. And I went at the Acreage campus. We met in the high school, and, it was a church of about 60 people. And every Sunday it was a set up, tear down situation. So I would get there at 5 a.m., setting up an entire PA system, running a rehearsal, leading services, and then hiking it all back out to the storage unit at the end. Like the set up, tear down church, man. If anybody out there watching this is in set up church, I feel for you. I empathize for you. I will pray for you. I guess that is a whole different level of ministry, man. But was there for a while. And then that was from there, my wife and I went to Oklahoma and spent some time there. It was a super unhealthy season. We were only there for like 6 months. Just the long story short, and this is kind of just, this is a bomb drop right here, but the pastor was laundering money through the church, which is crazy. I probably could have used that for my crazy ministry story too, but the helicopter eggs just seemed more appropriate. But anyway, pastor was laundering money. The whole staff got let go because of it, and we found ourselves stranded in what was my first full-time position. Now here we are in Oklahoma. We have no job, no income, no family, a handful of friends, and a very toxic situation. And so the Lord was faithful to us, man. We ended up in Kentucky, where my family lives, and spent a couple of years in Kentucky. And at that point, Scott, honestly, I had intended on not continuing in ministry. After an experience like that, I felt a lot of what we would probably call church hurt, like just that experience of, man, I don't know if I can trust the church. And that was a weird headspace for me to come to, but that was just kind of the raw emotions of that season. So I decided I was going to go back to school for physical therapy. That was kind of my thing. I was going to pivot and pursue something in that lane, and found a great church there. We were serving, and the worship pastor at that church was very, very comfortable being a band director and not so much leading worship from the front line position. And so he and I connected, and he gave me such an incredible opportunity to serve in a worship leadership capacity in a very safe place, sort of under his umbrella. I wasn't the staff guy. I didn't really carry the responsibility and the burden of the full-time position, but I was able to just walk in my calling, walk in my gifting, and heal. And so that was 2 years of that, which I was so thankful for, just to have that space in that time. That church also imploded with some bad leadership stuff. The last Sunday that I personally was there, we were actually watching the live stream from home. My son was just born, and we're watching the live stream. And after the opening song, the entire staff got up on stage with their resignation letters, and they resigned right there, one after the other, in the middle of service. And so my wife and I are at home watching, and we're like, what is going on? We're sitting at home. I mean, and Micah, like, picture right now, you have a 2-week-old baby. I mean, I'm holding my son, and like, I'm looking at my kid, and I'm looking at the screen, and I'm like, what is going on? And they're just all resigning.
You had no idea about this?
I had no clue because that's, again, I was in a volunteer role there, so I wasn't really
Oh,
privy to. I could see just from the proximity that there was some weird like stuff going on, but I obviously didn't understand the depth of it. And so we literally watched the staff resign, and it was kind of like, whoa, here we go again, another weird church blow up, right? And so I started to feel the point. This was end of 2017 until like January of 2018. Started to really feel this sense of like, man, maybe I am supposed to be in ministry, because it kind of feels like the Lord keeps using us in an unhealthy church environment to sort of be like the pillar of normal, you know. And so there was sort of this sense of burden of it, like maybe I am supposed to do this. And I didn't say anything about it to my wife. I kind of just sat on that, and I was wrestling with the Lord with it. And I was like, I don't want to do this. Like, please don't make me do this. I don't like this. This feels uncomfortable. It feels unsafe. And about 2 weeks later, the Lord used my wife, and this is the beauty of being married to a godly woman. It was just, I listened to the Holy Spirit. She pulled me aside one night, and she was like, listen, I think we need to consider getting back into ministry. And that's all I needed to hear. I hated to hear it because she affirmed what I knew the Lord was speaking into me, and he used her to kind of shake the dust off of my brain a little bit. And so then, in my infinite wisdom, I put the Lord to the test in this one. And I said, listen, God, if this is what you really have, like, you need to make this so abundantly clear, because I don't want to do it. Like, I'm still, like, I use the metaphor all the time. I was Jonah trying to run to Tarsus. I did not want to go to Nineveh. Like, I just want to do what I want to do and not feel that pull, that tension. And so the next day I went to school, and I had intended on finishing my undergrad at this school and then going to grad school right there. I was going to get automatic admission to it. It was going to be an easy transition. Family was there. It just made sense. I go to school the next day, and I get called into my advisor's office, and she tells me that my grad program that I had intended on enrolling in got cut due to funding, just to budget issues. And so I was like, oh, okay, well, I asked you to close the door, and that kind of feels like a pretty clear door closing. So
Yeah.
we started putting resumes out there again. I'm sure you guys know, like, the waiting game, sort of the hallway vibe of waiting to see which door you're going to go in, right, as you're preparing for a ministry
Yeah.
position. And we ended up in Texas, man, Houston, Texas, at a church called Magnolia Creek Baptist Church out there. Again, it was a smaller church with about 50, 60 people. And it was kind of an interesting situation because, like, again, coming out of our church in Oklahoma was bigger. Our church, you know, when I was in school at Calvary Chapel, that was a 10 campus, 20,000 person church. So I had a lot of larger church experience at this point. And then coming to a very small, intimate congregation was such a bizarre contrast for me, because I had to quickly realize that there were things that worked in a big church that did not work in a small church, and vice versa, and sort of navigating, like, okay, how do I scale my experience and what I've known to fit this context, and also how do I lead effectively in this context, because it is such a more intimate and personal connection at that point. And that was a really cool season for us. One of the biggest takeaways I learned as a worship pastor, it was such a cool thing to genuinely know the people that you're leading. When there's 50 or 60 in a room, you can know their names, you can know their life story, you can know what their week was like, because that's a small enough pocket of people that you can actually connect with them. And so that changed the way philosophically that I did a lot of things, because all of a sudden, you know, you're singing a song like Waymaker, and you know the couple in the front row, their marriage is on the rocks and they're fighting to save it. Like, that's a different context all of a sudden. Or you know, you're singing a song like Healer, and you know the guy in the fourth row is battling lung cancer. You know, and like, so all of a sudden you're able to make ministry personal in that context, and that was really a shift for me, because I had come out of a culture where it was kind of just a blanket vision, a blanket ministry for the room, and to be able to personalize it was cool. So, like I said, 2018 we got there. 2020, little thing called COVID hit, and which was a common thing in a lot of small churches. They were not prepared financially for a pandemic. I mean, we saw that everywhere, right? And so they weren't able to sustain my salary. So now we have a kid. We're in Texas. The cost of living in Houston, Texas it's not cheap. It's an expensive place to live. And we realize, again, this is not because of like toxic leadership, but ministry became volatile again. So it was like, man, like here we go again. We thought we had something secure, and the Lord shook us up. So we began to search again during COVID, and we moved here to Mississippi in 2020, which, a cross country move in the height of a pandemic with a at the time a 3-year-old was crazy. Like that was just a really bizarre time. But the Lord opened doors for us. And so here we are at North Park Church now. We've been here since 2020. I'm coming up on 4 years here next month. And it's been a ride, man. Like, and what I have really learned about this church has been really kind of interesting, because we run about 450 on average. If everybody that called us their church home would come on a Sunday, it would be closer to 700. So I would consider us sort of like in that middle-sized range. And it's kind of cool because there's two things about the season I love right now. I've never been in the position this long, so every day feels like uncharted waters for me, and I'm trying to learn more about establishing roots and how to lead in longevity, which has been a fun challenge. And I've also learned a lot because I have the big church background and the small church background. My pendulum swings very wide. The challenges of a mid-sized church are unique because a lot of times there's like the bigger church expectations, if you will. And sometimes there's the smaller church resources. And so trying to navigate how do we accomplish vision and accomplish goals and tasks and dreams. But a lot of it is you have to get crafty. You have to use the tools you have in your toolbox, and you don't just have the multi-million-dollar budget to just swipe the card and get it done. So there's been a lot of cool experiences in learning how to navigate that too. But yeah, so now here we are.
And also for context,
Scott.
Micah. No, it's okay. For context, Jordan and I connected through Leadership Focus. He was one of my students in the Leadership Focus module that I taught, and he was in it, and that's how we connected. So.
Yep. And ironically, Micah, I'm actually starting to coach Leadership Focus this fall, which that's kind of come full circle for me too. So I'm pretty pumped about that.
Are you done?
Yeah, I have one more Zoom call left, man. I finish up the end of the month.
That's good.
Yeah.
I guess, Scott, how is the rest of your experience in Leadership Focus? We talk a lot about Church of God and how we think of the things are going in Church of God, and kind of like things like ordination and things like credentials and state, national, and local. And I know that you had a little bit of trouble with that. So, like, what was your experience towards the end, or your Leadership Focus experience as a whole?
Yeah, it was all in all, I would say it was a positive one. I mean, I think Leadership Focus, and even now, it's already evolving. Like Course 1 now looks totally different than Course 1 when I started it. And so what I can appreciate is that they're evolving and changing it and adjusting it as they see issues pop up. I think early in my time, a lot of those issues rang true for me just in terms of like organizationally and kind of structurally. But granted, a lot of that too, Leadership Focus, it felt like for me early on was really geared for like an 18-year-old kid who is trying to like step into ministry for the first time. So a lot of the early stuff felt very repetitive and redundant for me, but I was also coming into it as a guy that had 12, 13 years of experience at that point. So it wasn't really fair for me to say that it felt elementary, because there was somebody else in my course that might have been perfect for, right? So my big thing with Leadership Focus is I wish there was a way to scale, like, okay, you've already got the experience and the knowledge and the background. We can start you in Course 3, right? Maybe something like that. And just, I wish there was a way to sort of get out of the process. But at the same time, because the Church of God is so unique, there was, in hindsight now, Monday morning quarterbacking this, I can see that there was value through all of it. Even though in the moment it may have felt a bit redundant. So, but all in all, I'd say it's been a positive experience. There's been a ton of value in it. The big thing for me has been the joy of getting to truly dive deeper and understand Church of God specifically, right? Because again, I come out of an SBC background. There's some similarities, but there's a lot of pretty stark differences too. And so getting to see some of those things and really even to sort of deconstruct my own faith a little bit in the process and figure out like where do I fall on some of these things has been largely beneficial to me too.
Mm-hmm. Good.
What were you going to say, Scott?
No, I was just thinking because you've talked a little bit about where you're at now at a mid-sized church and having the experience of leading worship in a small church, leading worship at a big church, and how it's very unique. I find it, I'm almost kind of curious as far as, from your point of view, what are the challenges in all those? What are like the blessings and the challenges in both of those situations? Like, what's the blessing of leading worship in a small church and its challenges versus the large church in the mid-sized church? Because I think a lot of times when people, like you said, like, oh, you have tattoos, so you're going to be at Hillsong or you're going to be at Elevation. And sometimes, that doesn't necessarily happen. A lot of times you are leading worship at a smaller church or a big church or wherever the case may be. So I think, kind of talk a little bit for people who may be listening to this who are looking into being worship leaders, like kind of like what are some of some things that they can expect? Like, here's some of the challenges you may face. Here's some of the blessings you'll face in this environment. So if you can share that.
Sure. Yeah, I think in the big church world, okay, it's so nice to have a budget. Like when you have, I mean, there were times, in our bigger church context where like the money literally didn't matter. Like you needed to spend 30 grand on lights. Okay, do it. Like it wasn't an issue. The flip side is like, that's a blessing. Obviously the resources is huge, and having like the roster too, like you're talking about churches that have 150 band members on their rotation. Like that's crazy, and so never having to worry about scheduling a band or filling a schedule out. Like those people were just there and they were always ready to go. So that's a blessing. I would say on the flip side of that, one of the cons of a large church is it's hard. You have to be so intentional to find intimacy with people because there's so many of them. Again, in a room of 2,000 people, you may know 50 of them, maybe. We have capacity as human beings for relationships. It's impossible for me to genuinely know that many people. I can't. There's not enough time in the day and not enough space in my brain to even to learn that many names. So the intimacy was a challenge, man, and being able to truly know people. And I think I've heard this a lot from people that attend bigger churches and have moved to smaller churches, which there's a lot of interesting statistics on millennials seeking out a smaller church now, which I think this ties into this on a psychological level. We want to be known as people. Like that's a thing. We don't want to just be a number or just a name in a church database. We want to actually be known and feel connected. And I think COVID may have played a role in that too, right? Social distancing, having to isolate for as long as everybody did. There's a desire to be known, and in a big church context, you really can't do that. We were joking earlier before we kind of got the ball rolling about like Micah, the lady knowing your name in church and you had no idea who she was. That's a very real thing in a large church setting because we're on a platform, right? So every Sunday you get up there and there you are on the big screen with the camera zoomed in on you and it says Jordan West, worship leader. So automatically everyone knows who you are. But you don't get to know who they are. And that's a very sort of bizarre thing. In a small church, like I mentioned, you get to know people, man, and you get to really cater your leadership style to those people. And so there's something really neat about that. The weakness of it, the con of it is the exact opposite of the big church, is that a lot of times there's no money. And so trying to figure out, I pulled up that church's live stream from Texas last Sunday. I was just curious to see what they got going on. We built a stage background in 2018 out of like old recycled pallets with that. Remember that was like the whole thing, like the rustic like pallet vibe. Like I feel like every church in America has been through the rustic pallet vibe at some point. But they still have it up, and it's like, I don't know if it's because they just love it or if it's just because there hasn't been resources to change it or fix it. But we did that whole stage design for like $20 and it's still riding. So there wasn't a lot of resources. So anything that we needed to do or change or come up with or build, a lot of it was like, okay, figure out a way to DIY this thing, and do it yourself. Which there's a fun challenge in that, but at the same time, like not having the financial resources to back those things can be tough. And in the same lane too, like learning how to build a team from the ground up. I had always inherited a worship team, which there's something unique about that. Like I never had to actually build a team when I got to Texas. And so I got there and there was no team. It was like, okay, here you go. Here's a microphone, lead worship. And so recruiting and developing and training, and then not just, part of what we want out of worship ministry is for it to be good, right? Like you don't want to just throw anybody up there that's going to make a noise, but it may not be a good noise. And then all of a sudden now your worship becomes distracting. We want it to be musically good. And so putting together discipleship training and to not just make sure you can play your instrument, but is your heart in the right place? Is your head in the right place? Are you healthy enough to truly understand? Because what I've always had a burden for, I don't want to raise up a worship leader that was me at age 20, right? Where you're just checking this box because you like to play music, but you really couldn't care less about your relationship with Jesus. And so I have a huge burden for not just can you play your instrument, but are you walking with the Lord? Are you genuinely practicing the way of life that Jesus calls us to? Are we modeling that for our church and for our communities? And so that was one of the challenges of the small church, was having to literally build people from the ground up. And then that was kind of neat because that translated a good bit to our season here in Mississippi. When I got here, I think we had maybe 10 or 11 people on our worship team, which, listen, by all intents and purposes, that's not bad. Like that's bigger and better equipped than a lot of churches out there. I can appreciate that. But because I had come out of a season of having to intentionally build and develop a roster, we now have 48 people on that same team 4 years later. And that's not because I'm an expert team builder. I was intentional, and the Holy Spirit opened doors because I was intentional and took steps, right? And so I just believe that He blessed the effort, and so we've had people that have joined our team and have stepped up, and now on any given Sunday, I might have 15, 20 people on the platform leading worship, which is really cool. And if you think about, 48 people in a church of 450, like 10% of our congregation serves on my team. That's a pretty cool metric. And so we're pumped about that. But again, so being able to pull from the big church and the small church and figure out where those things blend and mesh in the mid-sized church has definitely been a unique thing for me.
Yeah, it definitely. And I think that's like all that stuff you're saying is, I see it as relatively true. Just, being a pastor at I'm a pastor at a mid-sized church now, but I used to be a pastor at like a smaller size or even bivocationally. So even just kind of the things I hear from people who go to bigger churches, to everything else, like all that stuff is true. So thank you for that. One of the things that you have said as far as your approach to leadership in general is the idea of making sure your heart's in it and that your heart's in the right place. And I almost, and maybe Micah, you may agree or disagree, but I feel like a lot of times when I'm reading books on church leadership or I'm seeing things happening, whether in the news or different things about, toxic church leadership, or when churches have their implosions or explosions or whatnot, it always kind of boils down to not only just the way they were leading, but what was kind of, it was almost like the way they were leading was very corporate, but then when you start looking at the heart of the matter, it wasn't there. So I want to kind of have you share a little bit on why kind of leading from the heart is vital and important to a thriving ministry.
Yeah, I think that's good. And you're right. You can just, it's not hard to find, even in recent months, man, pastors that have fallen from high platforms, right? For me, I really think it's a situation where I don't ever want my capacity for ministry to grow faster than my heart can handle it. I think that is a danger zone where a lot of these church leaders get in trouble because there's rapid growth and rapid expansion. And if you don't have the character and the heart development to back that up, you end up with a house built on the sand and it's going to crumble. So for me, I think a lot of it comes to number one, we just want your heart in the right place. It's that simple. Just make sure you're actually bought into this. Because I think when you have equity in a vision that comes from a place of the heart, like that's a person that's bought in from a volunteer perspective, which is important. But more so, you can fake it for so long, man. Like you can see church leadership that knows how to read the script, that knows how to play the game, that knows how to pull the politics. But when push comes to shove, if the heart is not there, there will come a time where there will be a crack in the foundation and the whole thing's going to come crumbling down. And so for me, on a personal level, I don't ever want to be the guy that everyone thought, like, man, we thought he had it figured out. Like he seemed like he was cool. And then there's just this massive implosion. I've seen enough bad church context to be weary of the possibility of that, man. And I think a lot of that too, Scott, like you have to know your own heart, like know where are the areas, and truly self-assess, like where do I struggle, where are my danger zones. Micah, I'll never forget that one of the sections of Leadership Focus talks about guardrails, right? And I think Andy Stanley is the one that preached the series on that. But understanding like guardrails, he uses the metaphor that guardrails are there to keep you from driving off the road into the ditch, right? And so what are the things that you're putting to keep you on the road? And that the lane, you're going to change lanes, you're going to swerve a little bit, and you're going to get close to the guardrails, but having things in place that are going to keep you from just derailing and driving off the road completely. And I think the state of your heart is a big piece of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And then kind of the last question I have, and it's interesting. You talked about the beginning of your ministry and kind of, leading worship on Sunday, partying Friday and Saturday. And you had a mentor who came to you and had to do some real talk with you, talk some truth into you. And how that kind of changed your trajectory. I almost feel like where I have seen in ministry where I feel like there's not a lot of people who are willing to take that risk to say, hey, we need to sit down, we need to talk about something, because they're always afraid of a plethora of reasons. Just hearing your story of how that really changed your trajectory in a positive way. Have you ever had an experience in your ministry where, whether it may be like with a bandmate or maybe just another person you may be mentoring, that you had to say, hey, we need to talk. Like I have to share something. I have to talk to you because I'm seeing something that seems like it could go in a very bad place if we don't get you back into the right place.
Yeah, there's been multiple times. And honestly, if I'm being transparent, sometimes those conversations go great and sometimes they don't. But what I think is absolutely true, though, there's a direct correlation to the way those conversations go and the relationship that you've built with that person. So I think this all comes back to the intentionality of building relationships in ministry. If I don't truly know you and you don't truly know me, you're not going to be as open to receiving that kind of feedback, to receiving that kind of input. And in the same way, even being on the receiving end, like I can think of times in my life and in my ministry where someone's come up to me and said, hey, I think X, Y, Z. And it's like, dude, I don't know you from Adam. Like, what are you talking about? So it's hard to give credibility to those contexts without a pre-existing relationship being built. And so that's a big part too of why, especially part of our onboarding process with our worship team now, it's very relational. We want you to spend time. We want you to be, have conversations. We take you to lunch. We want to get a feel for who you are as a person, because inevitably it's going to happen. It's not going to happen with every single person on your team and in your church, but it's going to happen that you're going to have the hard conversations. And if you have put the groundwork in on the front end to build the relationship, those conversations go better. But like you said, Scott, people are afraid of confrontation, man. They're afraid to have these conversations sometimes. That's a blanket statement. That's maybe you're a person out there that just genuinely loves confrontation, which if that's you, then okay, cool, more power to you. But by and large, people don't like to have those conversations. And so I have also learned that there's a bit of a skill set to it where you may suck the first couple of times you have to do this, but gradually you can get better. And for me, so I'm 6'3", 275 pounds. Like I said, tatted up. I'm a big guy. And so I've actually had people on my worship team tell me before, like, you're intimidating, you're scary. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I'm a big teddy bear. So I understand now, like I have to be obnoxiously soft in the way I approach one of those conversations, because it's not hard for me to seem like I'm being abrasive, even though I'm just being direct. And so, even learning that about myself, like the way we communicate those things to people, and the reality too, everyone is different. Everyone's going to receive things differently. And so, if you truly know a person and you've done life with them and you've built a rapport with them, there may be two people on my team that need to both be addressed about the same thing. And those might be two very different approaches that I take, because I know them and I know, hey, if I take a direct approach here, that's going to shut you down. And so part of, I think, our job as pastors is to know our people well enough. Like, how do I shepherd you this direction to keep you on the right path without like just causing friction, right? I think, and some friction can be healthy, but we don't want to push people to the point that they're just shutting down and leaving the church, man. Like, people don't need a reason in today's day and age to leave the church. I mean, there's enough track record there that we can see that. And so, again, trying to just gently guide and lead, but being able to also speak truth and love. And that's the key part there, is the in love part. Like, I can tell you the truth all day, but if I don't do it with a loving posture, then it's just going to hurt you. It's not going to help you. So finding that balance. But yes, there's been multiple times, man, over the years where I've had to do that. And frankly, I don't love the conversations either. But again, thinking back in my own life, like I needed that conversation to get me to this point. And honestly, I haven't spoken to that guy in probably 8 years. That mentor of mine, I probably need to reach out to him, because I don't think he even knows the power that conversation had in my life. And there's a cool kind of tidbit there too. Like, sometimes we're planting seeds in ministry that we never get to actually watch firsthand as they grow and flourish and blossom, but that doesn't change the impact that you might have in the moment. So
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that might be, for those who are listening, who maybe you do have, maybe you have a staff member who that you can tell something's off about them, or another member of the church, or even just another pastor in a neighboring church that you meet for coffee, something's going on.
sure.
What you said is just the idea of making sure you build that relationship and know them. Because I think, if you know somebody, you're going to be have more permission to kind of basically speak truth, even though it's difficult and you don't want to hear it. But at the same time, you're also going to be able to go, well, I know this person's heart. They know my heart. So even if I am coming to them and I have to say, hey, we have to have a serious conversation about something, there's going to be that openness but again, you still have to do it in love, because if you're coming in like a freight train, even though you know the person, that can really kind of sever the relationship as well. So I think that's very key to what you said. Micah, do you have anything you would like to ask?
I don't necessarily ask, but more so comment on, the idea that, so I was on the phone with my in-laws last night, and we were, talking, FaceTiming, showing the baby, whatever. But we got into this conversation of like the arts, for example. I have my undergraduate degrees are in music performance, and I also work at a college now where I work in the college creative arts, and we put folks on a trajectory to graduate in 4 years and then not be able to get a job in the field that they got a degree in. And I think it's kind of fascinating, the parallel that Jordan was talking about, where, it's not always easy to find a career in ministry or something that will pay the bills, or, and Scott, you and I've had this conversation countless times about being bivocational, working full-time somewhere else, but also working part-time at a church, but being expected to put the full-time hours in at the church. And it's just, there's just this chasm that people just don't get, where it's like, hey, I also have to pay my bills. Hey, I also have to raise my family and keep my marriage, healthy, and myself healthy, and myself sane, and all of these things. And so, just an observation of something that Jordan said. It was just, it's kind of interesting how people go to, Scott and I went to seminary, right? When we graduated or when we finished, like, it's doesn't mean that we automatically get a job at a church, or
Right. Yeah.
I have degrees in music performance, and I have advanced degrees, and I have years of training and experience. Doesn't mean I'm going to get a job at Elevation or Bethel or Hillsong.
Right.
It's I think people need to realize that kind of going in. And I don't think that that's the case. And, from your story, Jordan, I think that's evident that, like, just because you have experience, just because you went to school, just because you have the background, doesn't always mean you're going to get the job.
That's right.
Or that there are jobs to be had, for that matter. So, like, I think of, Church of God, for example. We have Warner Southern, Warner Pacific, MacU, and Anderson, which are our Church of God colleges. And, they don't just offer ministry tracks as degree programs. But if you're going the route of ministry and get, BS in biblical studies or whatever, or ministry studies, or missions, whatever it may be, and even if you go to Anderson to the seminary and get a MACM or a MDiv or what have you, you rack up all this debt, or you go to college and get all this education, and then graduate, and then you can't find a church to work in. Like,
Yeah.
or you're determined that, hey, I want to go to the Church of God and do a Church of God route, or you may go somewhere completely different. Like Scott, in Scott's scenario, Scott's ordained in the Church of God, like we are, but he's currently working at a United Methodist Church, because when he transitioned out of his last ministry assignment, there wasn't a lot of Church of Gods that were hiring at the time. He was, and again, you were talking about the pandemic, like that was kind of Scott's path too. Like, he was in the middle of a transition. It's like he was working at a bakery, like third shift, to put money on the table so that he could pay the bills. And in the meantime, looking for position in ministry. But, like, long story longer, that it just amazes me that, like, we have this preconceived notion that we're just going to have a job when we finish either an education or a certificate or degree program, whatever it may be. And that's not always the case.
Well, and I think, I think in our state ministries here in Mississippi, we have just shy of 50 churches, I believe. It's like 47, 48. Don't call me on the exact number, but it's somewhere in that ballpark. Of those churches, we only have 2 or 3 that have a full-time worship pastor. So I think that's kind of an interesting snapshot too of there's not a lot of churches out there, man. Like, if you were to, I don't know what the numbers are. I'm sure someone has data somewhere, but if you were to look at the percentage of churches that actually can afford to staff a church full time, it's not a lot. And, so understanding that there are different challenges, and even in terms of like connectivity and trying to connect with other worship leaders in our movement, like that's kind of been a challenge for me on a local level, because they drive a truck. Right. There isn't any, right? Or like they're blue collar guys and girls that are working jobs or doing this, that, and the other. And Sunday's technically their day off, but they happen to be leading in their church. And so there is no time to build that relationship during the week.
Well, Jordan, I don't know if you heard this stat. Did your church send students to IYC?
Yeah.
Okay. So Scott was talking about this on last week's episode about how IYC, how many kids was it, Scott, that said they felt the call to ministry?
Well, I had to look. I couldn't find that stat because I know someone posted it and I looked for it, but I know there's at least 3,000 students that gave their lives to the Lord or rededicated their lives at IYC. But then I think it was like maybe 10% of them, so like 300 students felt the call to ministry or vocation or full-time. Oh, it said full-time vocational ministry. And I'm like,
and my point in that,
okay,
where are they going to go? Right? Like, there's not churches to either afford it or that are, in existence for that matter.
Yeah.
Scott and I are both in Ohio at the moment, but there's a big push for church planting in Ohio, but not really helping the churches that are struggling currently. But even, you mentioned it earlier, Jordan, like the setup, tear down church, you may or may not get 25, 50 people to come to church on Sunday, and you're setting up and tearing down, and you may not even be able to pay the bills. So
right.
again, you're setting these kids up for false hope in a sense. I mean, I don't know if I'm speaking out of turn when I say that, but it's like,
No, I think there's value there because I think, especially at a thing like IYC too. I think you're also battling the cliche camp high, right? Where like everyone there's like this increased sense of emotional movement and attachment to these things. And I think you see bands like SEU Worship up there, and like one of our kids actually was in the youth band. Hayden Clark, he got to go lead worship for that, and so it's kind of funny because I think back to those days when I was in his shoes, and that was a part of where I got to the headspace of like, oh, I'm destined for big and great and like flashy things because here I am at 17, 18 doing it. And so it created this sort of false dichotomy in my head that there was going to that ministry was always going to be like that. Instead of seeing like, no, that's a sample size every other year event that we intentionally craft to be this way, right? We had 9 kids from our youth group that felt that same call on this trip into vocational ministry. And it was kind of funny. Like I recognized my own cynicism in this because when we were sitting around our table at staff meeting, and our youth pastor was sharing that, everybody was like, "Oh, that's awesome, that's incredible," and my gut response was, "Ooh, that's like they don't know what they're getting into," kind of thing. Because ministry is challenging, man.
It's a great point though. It's a great point though because it's almost like a dopamine high or whatever, like in the moment where it's like, oh, worship is wonderful and there's these lights and we have really good speakers in this big event center wherever they're hosting the event, and then
Yeah,
you go back to your church and it's not nearly as glamorous as what you're seeing.
right. Yeah, and our kids, I mean, dude, the first they came back and immediately I had 5 or 6 kids be like, "Oh, we should get more lights. Oh, we should do this. We should." And I'm like,
Yep.
"Okay, so you went and you drank out of a fire hose and you tasted that quick. You said dopamine dump of that. And even that kid Hayden that I mentioned a minute ago, he and I, when I moved here, he was in 8th grade. And so he's coming up into his later high school years now, and he's a part of our Sunday rotation. Super talented kid. I mean, just all the talent in the world. And so I've been intentional to try to really build him up again on the heart side. The skill level's there. So we're trying to build him up in spiritual maturity now. And I don't think I'm exposing him when I say this, but I remember one of the conversations he and I had, he was like, "You have to do that?" Like talking about just some like the day in and day out stuff. And I said, "Yeah, man, like that's the reality of being a worship pastor. It's not all just grabbing your guitar and letting it rip. There's other
Yep.
pieces of the puzzle here." And he looked me dead in the eye and he said, "Well, I'm not going to work at a church like this. I'm going to work at like an Elevation." And I had to laugh because I was like, "Oh," I was like, "That I was in your shoes, buddy." And I love Hayden. He's a fantastic kid and he's come a long way. But again, I think this is the reality of these bigger churches, man. Like the exposure's there, the YouTube content's there. They're pushing all of these things, and these kids are digital natives. They exist on their phones, and so they're seeing the glamour of this, and I think they're equating like, oh, that's what ministry looks like. They're not seeing the church down the road where the pastor has been struggling for 30 years to try to build something, and they're just barely paying their utility bills and keeping the lights on. And he's trying so hard to be faithful to keep serving his church. And they don't see that side of ministry. They see, the big, flashy, content-driven world, which is scary to an extent. I mean, there's value in that world. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that, those things are bad, but I think they do create a bit of a false expectation to a young kid who's only seeing that. So,
yeah, and I can even think about when I was in school at Anderson, when I was doing not only my ministry portion but my acting portion, and one of my friends said she wanted to be like the head, do like creative arts ministry at Willow Creek. And be like,
okay,
I mean,
yeah.
And she actually did. She sent a resume. Actually, she went through the whole theater program, ministry track, sent a resume to Willow Creek. They said, "Nope, sorry, no." Like they just basically rejected her right up that. And I think that kind of crushed her. but kind of also knowing what we know now about what happened at Willow Creek, that may have been a blessing. But so I think there's always going to be kind of that healthy, maybe even sometimes that unhealthy real visualization, like, oh, I want to serve at Bethel or Hillsong or Elevation, or like these big churches that have these great music programs and that push out music, like every year they push out new music. And I think a lot of times, it's always good to have those aspirations, but also kind of, if you don't get there, it's okay, because it's not about being on the big stage with the lights. It's about where our heart is and about serving the Lord. And if we're doing that, then he's always going to put us in the places that we need to be to, not only serve him and do it very faithfully, but also to kind of give us a hope in the future, make sure that, we're at a place where we feel loved, we feel valued, a place, like even after your first big church blow up, the next place you're at, you're volunteering, but it was also a great place of healing for you before, the mass resignation. But, there were certain seasons where God, but at the same time, there are certain seasons where God puts you in certain things for you to use your gifts and talents to do good. But also, this is a time for rest and for healing for you now. And when
that's right.
And then we can move you to this next place, this next part of your journey.
That's right. And I think for me, it comes down to the idea of complacency versus contentment, right? Complacency, like, are you just being lazy and just don't want to put the work in, and you're just like, whatever, I don't really care, because there's also apathy that comes with that. But contentment is understanding that, like, I'm genuinely able to find joy in the season that the Lord's called me to, even though it may not look like what I thought it would look like. I can still find joy in it because I know that I'm still having ambition. I still have drive. I still want to better myself and pursue great things. But this is just where God has me right now. And there's a peace and a clarity that comes with that. And for me, I had to get to that place because, again, I felt like I was missing something by being in a small church. There were days where it was like, man, I and even seeing some of my classmates, like from some of my school that were in bigger, thriving churches, that I was just like, man, like, how did I land myself here? And I finally got to the place of, well, I didn't do this to myself. This is just where the Lord's called me to right now. And that's okay. And learning to be content with that and not, I think a lot of people, this is a trend right now, that people are using churches as like a stepping stone to keep like advancing their career. I get that to an extent, because if you go on churchstaffing.com right now and look up some of these bigger churches that are hiring, one of the prerequisites is you have to have experience in a big church. Well, how do you do that? You have to keep moving up, right? and qualifying yourself. But there's value in just being content. Like, the Lord's called me here to this season for a purpose, and I'm going to establish roots. I'm going to dive in, I'm going to get deep, and I'm going to do whatever I can to make this season the very best that I can, because the Holy Spirit's called me to it. That's contentment, and not just sitting back like, all right, well, I guess I'll serve my time here and see what comes next.
Yeah, absolutely. No, but this has all been great. So, yeah, Jordan, thank you so much for sharing your story and sharing your experience. I think this has been very helpful, not only for me just listening to you talk and go, oh yeah, a lot of this stuff is making sense, but I think for anybody else who listens to this episode, I think they're gonna really see a treasure trove of wealth and information and just spiritual wisdom that's coming from you and your ministry. So thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you guys, man. I've enjoyed the time with y'all. Micah, it's good to see you again, buddy. I miss you, dude.
Yeah, you too. Same. We'll have you come. We'll have you back. I mean, we did, but we have repeat. What is it, Scott? Repeat guests, or like the same guests come on, numerous times. So we'll have you come back.
Love it. Let me know when.
All right, sounds good. And friends, thank you so much for listening to the Scott Stedman podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If this episode is helpful to you, or it'll help another friend in ministry, feel free to just share this. And then feel free to leave us a comment. Any comments you leave us, we read, we comment back on them. And if they're good, which most of them are always good, we'll read them here on air. So guys, thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you for listening to the Scott Stedman podcast. The Scott Stedman podcast is made possible by support from our listeners. We thank listeners like Patty and Scott, whose support goes to this podcast's continual growth and maintenance. If you want to support this podcast, you can do so in a number of ways. First, feel free to give us a 5-star rating if you enjoyed this episode and share it with your friends. If you'd like to financially support the Scott Stedman Podcast, you can go to the website ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman Podcast. That website again is ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.